Just tell us where you're starting, please.
I'm starting on page 7. We have just completed logical positivism. And we were dealing, if you may recall, just to get the thrust of it, with what's called moral positivism. And what it has in common is the notion that morality is the product of somebody's will. And therefore, we see classical positivism, where it's the will of God, where we have a kind of, within that as subdivisions, you have the idea of it being the will of the state or the will of the people, and then you have naturalism, which is a kind of positivism. I've got to be careful here, because it seems to me if you reduce all reality to nature, I'm not certain that you're talking about it being the will of somebody, but certainly it is positivism in the traditional sense of being nothing but that which is based upon what is sensibly observable. And then, of course, finally, the logical positivists, it isn't the will of anybody because there is no ethics. They take care of it very nicely. So positivism has an analogous application in those three contexts, but the one that we particularly think about is the moral positivism, classical positivism, which says that the moral law is the law of God. It's whatever he wills. So in principle, he could make adultery a virtue, if you follow that. Or he could make exceptions to the rule so that something might always be morally wrong, but in this case it will be morally right. Now, in other words, the idea is it's whatever he says. Now, nobody wants to get into an argument with God, but what is opposed to moral positivism is an appeal to the nature of the act itself, that some acts by their very nature are wrong and there's nothing you can do about it. And so some acts are naturally good or bad, just we say by their very nature. Now, here's the metaphysical foundation for this. God is the foundation of nature. And therefore, when he creates things with a given nature. And for him to give a thing a certain nature and then allow that it could act in a way that contravenes that nature would be to contradict the nature and to contradict his own intention in making it, which is absurd. So it would be like saying if God wanted it, 2 + 2 would be 5. Well, no, it wouldn't. You can call it 5, but it's still 4. Because that's the nature of 2 and the nature of 4. And there's nothing anyone can do about it, including God, because God's the foundation for it. It's not like we're limiting what he can do. It's simply a recognition of the intelligibility of his own acts. So that in framing man's nature, there are certain things that are good for man and certain things that are bad for man. And God can't just flip that over because he wants it to be a different way. Otherwise, his own act in creating us would be unintelligible. It would make no sense. God is bound by some rules. For example, he's bound by the principle of non-contradiction. As a matter of fact, he's the basis of the principle of non-contradiction. A thing cannot both be and not be, ultimately because God himself is absolute being and cannot not be. So, again, another example, as you see in your notes, is God can't make cruelty a virtue. How can you make cruelty good under any circumstances? I mean, stop and think about what cruelty is. I mean, it's by its very nature bad. There's nothing good about it. You can't make it good, and God himself could not make it good. But remember, that's not a limitation on God. That's the old problem of, is God omnipotent? And in metaphysics we learn, well, yes, God's omnipotent. Does that mean he can make a square circle? No. Can he make a rock bigger than he can lift? No. Could he make another God? No. Could he do evil? No. But God can do anything. The point is, those aren't things. They're contradictions in terms. For God to make another God, the one that is made would not be God. It would be a creature, not a creator. So that's impossible. So God can do anything that's possible. The impossible is self-contradictory. Some things are impossible because there's no one around to make them. But some things are impossible because they contradict their very terms. And that's the difficulty you have. You cannot make cruelty to be something good, just by its very nature. All right, so examples of things that are good: fidelity, faithfulness, decency, mercy. Go out and be unmerciful. Blessed are the unmerciful. How are you going to do that? That's what moral positivism would suggest. Mercy by its very nature is a good and appropriate to man's nature and to God's nature. Charity, what's God going to say? Go out and don't love anybody. Go out and hate people. It just doesn't make sense. It's utterly impossible. God, as we've so often heard, is love. That's not a bad thing to say. It's just we heard it too many times. So affirming charity is simply to affirm being, which is to affirm the good, because good and being are convertible. As far as evil acts, how do you make cruelty good? We've already discussed that. Parricide, that means to kill a parrot. No. I think it means to kill your parents. Mass murder of the innocent. That just doesn't go down well with anybody, not even the positivists. They always look for examples. I'm always amazed at the people who say, I can't believe in God because look at the horrible things he's permitted, like the mass murder of the innocent. Well, the problem with that, this is something C.S. Lewis noticed. The reason he was an atheist, because of all the horrible injustices in the world. And then it dawned on him, where'd I get this notion of injustice? Where'd I get this notion of justice? See, there's a natural intuition of an ethical value that is built into even the atheists, even the positivists. There's no basis for ethics in the natural physical world, but everybody's got ethical values. Even the most ardent atheist would not tolerate the mass murder of the innocent if you put it in those terms. They may in fact do it other ways, but they won't give approval to it as such, which means everybody has a built-in sense that there is such a thing as justice and injustice. And what on earth is it based on? If everything's just a pile of atoms, a pile of inert, at least non-living molecules and atoms and forces, what on earth is the basis of the notion of justice? There's no reality to value. That's what the positivists, the logical positivists, initially said. And that's why they said there's no basis for ethics. They got it. They understood. If everything is based on what's empirically observable and that's the only thing that has any meaning, then ethics has no meaning. The difficulty is even they couldn't live with that. So they had to transform it into something else and say, well, it's what enough people approve of, that's what's ethically good. They had to get a meaning for it, because everybody knows it is not utterly meaningless. The difficulty is there are some things we understand to be right or wrong by their very nature, and not just because of custom, not just because of approval. It's something that we perceive in the very nature of things. The mass murder of the innocent is not wrong because we did a Gallup poll to find out how many people disapproved of it. It would be wrong if everybody said it was right. That's the difficulty. There is an objective basis to moral right and moral wrong, and you can't get it out of a completely naturalistic, positivistic, materialistic view of the world, because from that there really just isn't a basis for it. And people intuitively know it, and that's why you see the materialist or the atheist struggling with the notion of ethics, struggling with the notion of value, because he really doesn't have anything to base it on, but he can't quite get rid of it. So opposed to moral positivism, there are some things by their nature are good or bad. And the reason we know it is because under D there, notice, the intellect can know natures. We do know the natures of things. And we do, for that reason, we say sense, but we don't really mean that. We mean we understand that there are some things that are morally ordered in a proper way and some things that are not. Whether we can spell out why it is morally right or wrong, that's another issue. See, it's one thing to know that murder the innocent is wrong. It's another thing to be able to spell out why it is wrong. Because we have an intellect, we know the nature of things. Remember, intellect understands. Intus legere, it reads within. That's what the intellect does. It penetrates beyond the sensible phenomena to read to the noumena, to the thing in itself, to the nature, the substance, the essence of the reality. And we do that even in ethical matters. And that's why we condemn certain acts, because we understand them and understand that they are utterly opposed to the nature of the good. Because we have an intellect, we can understand human nature and we can examine the relationship between our nature and its integral parts and the ordering of its acts towards our last end, which ultimately is God. And that's ultimately the basis for natural law. We can know human nature. We can see what acts are ordered towards the perfection of that nature and what acts are destructive of that nature. And as we've established earlier, those acts that are ordered to the perfection of that nature are also ordered to getting man prepared for his last end, not in this life, but in the next life, which is ultimately union with God by knowledge and love. Perfect happiness is not to be had in this world. So the norms for the natural goodness and evil, which means that some acts are by their very nature good or bad, good or evil, independent of anybody's will. Doesn't matter what you want. You can't make cruelty a nice act just because you want it to be. Doesn't work. And of course, the interesting thing is that even the most evil of men always will try to justify their behavior somehow. Somehow they'll try to say, well, this is really good because I'll slaughter 1 million people, but I'm going to save 100 million when I'm done. They always feel they've got to justify what they're doing. And the whole point is, if there's no basis for ethics, why justify anything? Why not just be quite consistent and just say, I'm doing what I want? And if it's evil, it's evil, but I don't see, of course, they can't even say that. They'd have to say, well, it isn't evil, and it isn't good, it's just what I want. Because there is no good or evil. If you allow there is good or evil, you immediately get into the problem of ethics, unavoidably. Okay, so how do we know that some acts are good? And again, a little history here. First, intuitionism. People like Shaftesbury, Reed, G.E. Moore, Max Scheler. Fundamentally, the thrust of this is that there's something built right into us, that we just know good or evil when we see it. That's a direct intuition. We don't reason it out. We have, as Shaftesbury says, an inborn moral sense. Thomas Reed, common sense philosopher, you just know it. It's just, we just know what is right. We know what's wrong. It's just built into us. This is the false notion of conscience. Pinocchio, the idea, let your conscience be your guide. Your conscience is always right, as we will see. Of course, it isn't always right, but there is that false notion that there's something built right into us. Your conscience will tell you if something's right or wrong. Don't worry about it. You'll just know it. That's intuitionism. problem, of course, is that some people's consciences oppose other people's consciences. And then you've got to sort it out. Or, as in the case of Moore and Shaler, it's just the idea you just know that it's right, but then the problem arises, well, how do you know it's right? And you'll find these people who say that you just have an inbuilt sense suddenly will start giving you reasons why it's right, because you can't help. You can't help it. You say, well, I intuitively know it's right. Well, how do you know it's right? Well, because, and then they start telling you why. Well, if they're going to tell you why, you don't need a built-in intuition. You're reasoning about it. And if you're reasoning about it, that's not just pure intuitionism. Something else is going on. And you'll find most people don't rely on just their instinctive reaction, obviously because people's instincts and the moral order are different. Not everybody agrees. I mean, cannibals think that what you have for lunch, can be thy neighbor. The Christian says, love thy neighbor. The cannibal says, eat thy neighbor. Both equally happy. I won't go into the further details one could get into there, but I won't. Now, the next form of natural goodness or evil, ironically, comes in the form of the utilitarianism of John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. Bentham first and then Mill, which seems kind of an odd thing, but it's the notion that we have as it were, a principle that we follow to promote the greatest good. And the greatest good for the greatest number is what is morally right. There's a little finesse between Bentham and Mill, in that Bentham thought that the only thing that really mattered was the delights, the pleasures that we have immediately in this sensory world, whereas Mill said, well, no, beyond the pleasures, there are also the finer things, the intellective experiences and art and poetry and speculating and ethics and metaphysics, and those are good too. And so he made some famous observation about preferring to be a human being suffering than a happy pig.
That was Bentham, you said?
No, it was Mill critiquing Bentham. Bentham was the pig. I mean, he didn't mean to, he didn't say it quite that way, but that was the thrust of it. So, the morality of an act is naturally measured by its utility as a means to an end. In other words, an act is good if it gets us to what we perceive as a good end. And what is good, as I said, is a little disagreement between Bentham and Mill as to what the nature of the good is, but in both cases, it's a good in this world of the things that we would naturally seek, either pleasure or the more aesthetic values that Mill would defend. This comes down to what we call consequentialism, which basically says the end justifies the means. Now, of course, we've got to be careful there, because everybody seeks a means to an end. If the end, as Joseph Fletcher once said to me, if the end doesn't justify the means, pray tell what does. Of course the end justifies the means. That's not the issue. The issue is, does a good end justify an evil means? That's the issue. Traditional ethics and philosophy has always insisted that the end does not justify the means, but by it is meant that the good end does not justify the evil means. And the irony of it, look at the date that we have today, which is September 9th, 2011. As you know, in 2 days it will be 9/11 plus 1 decade. And I recall in the days immediately after America was so viciously attacked in New York, that even some of the reporters we're able to say, we have seen evil. We have seen something that is truly evil. Mind you, we live in a world, in a country, in a time when it's pretty hard for people to see evil. And you sure didn't hear that coming from reporters very much. But I recall many of them said, yes, we have seen evil. And remember, the argument was, well, these terrorists are simply seeking to achieve their end, whatever they perceive it to be, and the fact that innocent people, women and children, were being slaughtered in the process was simply a necessary means to the end. And believe it or not, I actually heard a reporter, I can't remember who it was, but a very famous one, get up and say, this reminds us that the end does not justify the means. I never thought I'd hear that coming from a TV set. The only other time I believe that it was said, memory's pushing me a wee bit here, but when back in the days of Richard Nixon, John, who was the guy who blew the whistle? John Dean, testifying before Congress. Also, I remember him saying that the end did not justify the means. But how rarely we hear that. And how, in practice, within no time at all, they got a professor from California on TV, and one of the reporters said, but isn't this the sort of thing that you folks are teaching? That, if somebody really has an end that they seek to pursue, that they could use any means to get it. And you'd think immediately after 9/11 they wouldn't have done this, but he immediately came forth and said, oh yes, it's quite legitimate to do this under the circumstances and according to the perception which these terrorists had, you see, because they were seeking that which was good, but in their eyes. But I always remember that famous citation from the Old Testament, which interestingly enough was used in the context of racial justice very frequently, which says, he who says that he loves God but hates his neighbor is a liar.
Isn't that New Testament?
Well, you're probably more up, I thought it was Old Testament.
I think it's I think it's James or John.
St. James.
Okay, very, very good. I stand corrected, but it's clearly biblical.
Clearly biblical.
He who says that he loves God and hates his neighbor is a liar, and that's the ultimate problem these Islamic terrorists had. That in the name of pursuing what they viewed to be the good, wonderful good from their perspective, a justifiable good from their perspective, they were willing to deliberately take the lives of the innocent. And that's what horrified the world. That's what always horrifies the world, and that's what always reminds us of the absolute apodictic difference between genuine morality and the false mishmash that we see our world immersed in today. We can turn the page. Now let me see, I have we will spend a little more time on this question of the means and the end later on, because right now we're just trying to get introduced to some of the general notions of ethics. The second example of a kind of naturalist, I have to watch the headings that we have for these because I keep losing them. This would be under naturalism still, because we had intuitionism and utilitarianism. Under utilitarianism, I like this one, if you call this an ethical system, opportunism. In other words, what's immediately good for me, that's the good. I guess this is an ethical system, if you think about it. He's just an opportunist, but I don't want to say this of all politicians.
The examples readily come to mind.
Yes, I mean, you're not supposed to judge people, you know, in their heart, but it's sort of like when you're dealing with a used car salesman. Are you supposed to presume that everything he tells you is true? You would be rather foolish to do that. So, you know, you don't judge the person in their heart, but you do have to make a practical, pragmatic judgment of who you're dealing with. And similarly, it is, one sometimes does suspect that politicians have purposes that are over and above the pursuit of the common good, at least in some cases. Pragmatism, this is an interesting thing. If there was ever an American philosophy, it's pragmatism. William James. The how to do it, how to fix it mentality. What is useful, the measure of the good, the measure of the true is what is useful, which is kind of amazing when you think about it, because what it means to say is that 2 + 2 is 4, not because it is 4, but because it's useful to say that it's 4. In other words, it's true because it works. If I'm measuring things and I use 2 and 2 being 4, it works very nicely. Now that, of course, is the reverse logic of what everybody formerly thought, namely that because 2 and 2 is 4, it works when you're adding. Whereas according to James, it's true because it works when you're adding. Kind of different. But of course, the difficulty with pragmatism is it allows you to justify everything and anything. This is an entire tradition going back to Bentham and Mill and James and Peirce and Dewey and, well, up to the modern situationists such as Joseph Fletcher. They're all in the same tradition. And they all would maintain that the end, the good end, justifies the means. Which is exactly the logic that was underpinning the terrorists on 9/11. Except, of course, they say it with a sweeter expression on their face. I remember debating at some length with Dr. Joseph Fletcher. I don't know how many of you remember him or know of him. He's sort of the American face of situation ethics back around 1970. And I was on 2 half-hour back-to-back TV programs with him. And it was the most difficult thing to get him to explain really why, when he said, you got to do the loving thing. That's what you do. And but what's the loving thing? How do I know what the loving thing is? He never would spell it out on TV. It was after the show was over that we continued speaking, and he finally said, well, it's whatever will do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Case closed. That's utilitarianism. So there's nothing new. So they called it the new morality. There was nothing new about it. It was just the old immorality, justified by a utilitarian ethical principle. But they didn't want to call it utilitarianism because if they did, everybody would know it went back to the early 1800s, and there was nothing new about it at all.
He couldn't get tenure.
Well, I met him when he was on his way to an appointment in the Southeastern Medical School as a professor of ethics there. I don't know whether he got there or not. I mean, if you met him, he was the sweetest and kindest, gentle old man that is probably no older than I am, but that you would want to meet.
But you have to have a new thought when you're looking for
Also,
tenure.
the problem.
Doing the loving things was the language. That was the language of the early 70s.
Right. And of course, you could sweetly justify all kinds of rather heinous things. That was at the time that abortion had just really taken hold. But Fletcher was ahead of the time because I was still talking about that, and I'm trying to remember. We raised the question of I think the German measles. They were concerned about the damage that would do to a child. That the child could be born blind, is it? And so the question was whether that could justify an abortion. And he came right out and said, well, you know, it would make perfect sense so we don't eliminate a child that would see. It would be better to let them be born and then kill them. You know, then we know which ones are blind and which ones aren't. But this was where his logic took him. There really was no limit. And then I thought of him going to that medical school to teach the physicians their ethics, medical ethics. People often forget that the medical doctors are not born knowing ethics. They are taught ethics, or they're taught the code that is the tradition within their school, but ultimately they get their ethics from ethicians. So they're actually, if they're being taught in a formal way, they're being taught by PhD ethicians. But unfortunately, most of them are what they call ethicists, who are operating on a utilitarian principle, if you call it a principle. So basically, it's a very sophisticated form of utilitarianism that is being taught in the medical schools. And of course, we come to John Dewey. I always think of his wife after he died. She said, "Poor John, I think he's lost." He was the educationist who taught for, was it 50 years at Columbia University, and influenced an entire generation of school teachers. And his basic principle is that there really isn't any truth, that we have to engage in experimentation because we can't know truth. So what you have to do is to constantly experiment and constantly adjust and constantly move what you think you know so that you know more and more. I always use the example down here at Lewiston Porter. I don't know if they still have it, but when my kids were going to the primary school down here, they had a little newsletter that came out every month, and it said Lewiston Porter Primary School, and then they had a motto, where learning to learn is fun. It's got to be fun or it's not worth learning. But watch the first words, learning to learn. You don't learn something, you learn how to learn. You know, it's sort of like pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. So what matters is not that you have any formal education, but you just learn how to learn. Of course, this is consistent with the process philosophy that you find in John Dewey and Bergson and Leslie Duarte and others.
Was Dewey one of the signers of the Humanist Manifesto?
Yes.
He was.
I would be amazed if he were not. Yeah. But this, I mean, obviously you've got an entire school of thought out there. This goes hand in hand with the secularism and the secularist humanist doctrine that is so pervasive today and so dominant within the natural sciences, and which brings to bear its effect upon social legislation at every level. So you really have a very forceful ethic being taught. I mean, for those who say, well, we shouldn't have religion in society, total separation of church and state, this is the church of secular humanism, totally dominating the legislative process of the state. And thus you have every form of progressive advance that you can imagine, from completely secular sex education, abortion, contraception, same-sex marriage, and anything else you can invent, and for which there seems to be no limit now, because people are now beginning to realize if you could have same-sex marriage, why not make it polygynistic or
Polygamist.
Yeah, as I told you before class, I've been working on Adam and Eve for the last week, so I'm thinking of polygynism, but it's polygamy that we're talking about here. Okay. So how do we measure the good or bad acts in this tradition? The hedonists seek pleasure for the individual, and that would include people like Democritus, Epicurus, Hobbes, and Feuerbach. And the altruists seek happiness for society. That would include Bentham, Mill, Auguste Comte, Wendt, and Marx. Don't think by that this means, when we say altruism, that it means that they really are seeking the good of other people, because it's still being measured in a utilitarian fashion, ultimately, and therefore there are no moral principles. Because, you see, the logic of the utilitarian way of looking at things, if the end justifies the means, then any means can be justified. If any means can be justified, then you have no moral acts that by their very nature are bad. There's no such thing as a moral act that by its very nature is bad, which means you have no moral principles. And that's why this former colleague of mine at the University of Dayton published an article entitled Situation Ethics, in which he said explicitly, by situationism, what I mean is that I have no moral principles. As I long thought, I would not hire this person for a babysitter. There is nothing worse I could say to you. I mean, if I walked up to you and said, you have no moral principles, you'd be ready to pull out a gun and shoot me. Challenge me to a duel, understandably, properly. But this man comes out and says he has no moral principles. But in so saying, he speaks the truth, because that is the whole essence of the utilitarian, pragmatic way of looking at morality. If the end is good enough, anything is legitimate to get there. It may be disgusting, it may be something your emotions can't easily handle, it may be something that looks horrible to deal with at the moment, but if the end is good enough, it is justifiable. And in those terms, that means there is no act, literally, that is so bad you can't perform it. No act. Now, there could not be a greater dividing line between ethical systems than what you see right there. And that is virtually the universal opposition you see between those who say, wait a minute, there are some acts that by their very nature are immoral and you can't ever do them, such as abortion, such as infanticide. Never justified. And those who would say any act can be justified if the end is good enough. The problem is that when you bring these issues to the context of social legislation, the utilitarians have always won the argument, because they will drag out some horrible example wherein it appears that the universal principle should be, we should have an exception to it. You know, here's some poor woman, if she carries a child to term, she's definitely going to die, and the child will be deformed. Therefore, in this one unique case, we should allow abortion. Well, the problem is, if you allow a single exception to a rule, you have no rule. The notion of a rule is that it's universal, that it always applies. So you can almost divide your morality very simply between those who say that there are rules that always apply and those that say there are no rules. Because you see, there's no such thing as having half a rule. You can't have a 90% rule. You either have a rule or you don't have a rule. And if you don't have a rule, you have no moral principles, as this situationist himself publicly proclaimed. I'm not putting words in his mouth. So in a very real sense, as we go through ethics, that's the dividing line that you're looking at. Natural law ethics says that there are some acts that by their very nature are immoral and there's nothing you can do to make them good. And no matter how great the end that you're seeking, you still can't do it. Whereas every form of utilitarianism, which is extremely popular, I mean, after all, the Benthamites, Jeremy Bentham, his disciples actually became a political party in the English Parliament in the early part of the 19th century. And it's always popular to say, we can always solve a problem. No matter what a problem is, there's always a solution. And to have people stand up and say, but you can't do that, you know, in this circumstance doesn't justify this, that you're never allowed to do it, that's viewed as being closed-minded. See, if you're progressive and you're open-minded and you're in keeping with the changing times in which we live, morality has to flow into that which comes. Like this same gentleman was the one who said that morality is like an amoeba that puts out a pseudopod, and pretty soon, if it seems favorable to move in that direction, the whole amoeba goes into the pseudopod, and that's the new place of the amoeba. So too with social legislation. What was one time prohibited is eventually seen as being too restrictive because we find circumstances that it seems not to apply in and as a legitimate and reasonable thing, and therefore we have to make exceptions. And of course, the moment you make an exception, there is no rule.
There are those who simultaneously believe of the immorality of murder, but at the same time support capital punishment.
Right, I'm one of them.
Isn't that making an exception to the rule?
No, you have to understand what murder is and what capital punishment is, and they're not the same. But we will get to that. But indeed, you're quite correct. There has to be a logical consistency within natural law ethics so that you don't have one principle contradicting another. That would never be permissible. But what I'm trying to get at here is the more basic position as to whether you can have anything that by its nature is wrong. The utilitarianism says there is nothing that by its nature just can't be done. So there are no naturally evil acts that can never be justified. So we'll when we deal with certain specific types of acts, of course, we'll see what the foundation for them would be and why they can be defended as a universal. But what's really at issue here, see, it comes down to epistemological, metaphysical principles. Your ethics always does. The ethics doesn't just float by itself. It rests upon the fact that things have natures. We have natures. Moral acts have natures. And we have an intellect that can understand the nature of an act just as it understands the nature of man. And because we can understand the nature, and because we all share the same common human nature, there are certain acts that are commonly shared by us that can be categorized and classified as being contrary to the nature of man as a whole. And hence such acts will always be inconsistent with man's true good. In other words, they universally must be condemned as morally evil by their very nature. And if you can't say that, you have no ethics, because ultimately that's what utilitarianism gives you. No ethics, because there isn't anything you can't do. There is no act that you just can't perform. What they're always going to say, as Dr. Fletcher insisted, it all depends on the situation. It all depends on the circumstances. That's one of the things we're going to have to look at. Is it true that the circumstances can change the morality of an act to the point where what was said to be morally evil turns out to be morally good because of the circumstances? But what I want you to pay attention to is that in the public arena, utilitarianism always tends to win. Because all the proponents of the change in a law do is to look around and find an example where the law seems to be applied so badly that the whole principle must be cast overboard. And that's why you always heard in the case of abortion, the complaints about back alley abortions, which were killing women right and left and so forth. This is a typical argument that you don't address the morality of the act itself, you address the consequences of trying to observe that morality. Nobody ever said observing morality is always going to be easy. Nobody ever said that it will never be without pain or suffering. But what is at issue is there morality? Because your alternative is that there really are no moral principles at all. So you have to understand that, you're really going to throw out the baby with the bathwater here. Every time you see a slide, a little movement in social legislation in a progressive direction, always it's a matter of the camel getting his nose under the tent. Just a little bit. And if he's in there, before you know it, the whole blasted animal's inside the tent. And we've seen this happen again and again and again. And the presumption that, nobody would ever do that. I mean, I think of examples, and I'm sure you already know of them, but what is happening already following same-sex approval in New York State is we are seeing conferences being held giving approbation to pedophilia, literally, because they're saying that we've had too much attention paid to the victim. We have to have more sympathy for the poor pedophile who's having difficulty living life with these inclinations.
These are psychiatrists who are also saying children are sexual beings. They're actually arguing that now.
Oh yeah, and therefore the age of consent for children should go way down to nothing. But this is what you get, you see, when you break a principle. If there are moral principles and you just bend them a little bit, you got to wind up with the logic of what comes from that. And what ultimately led to it, I'm trying to think what this was based on. I think it was Antonin Scalia pointed out in a decision of the Supreme Court in one case, I think it was the one where they legalized sodomy. And he pointed out that if you once say that an act is licit simply because somebody wants to do it, you've lost the frame of reference in which to judge anything. And logically, that's what led, I think, to the notion that people should be able to marry anybody they want, because it's what they want. Once you have defined, and I think the issue was the definition of marriage, once you have said that sex can be taken out of the context of marriage, you have removed it from any kind of an objective criteria for acts. And once you do that, anything's justified. The only thing that's holding you back from certain acts is custom. And that's why we always use the example. We used to use the example of bestiality as something no one would approve of. Well, I got news for you. It's getting approved. There are people who are suddenly thinking, oh, this is okay. Because logically, if you can't see the logic of where your steps are going logically, you have to live with the consequences. And they'll take you anywhere. I recall in 1964, when I was teaching at the Loyola University in New Orleans, an old Jesuit there, he was really old, he was 54, told me why contraception was wrong. He said, if contraception were right, if it were illicit, then there would be no basis in principle to object to homosexuality. And that was the end of the argument, you see. Because at that time, nobody would have sanctioned homosexuality. But of course, the logic of what he said has been borne fruit, because having now justified contraception, we have no logical opposition or reason to oppose homosexual acts. You live with the immanent logic of what you do. So as Aristotle or St. Thomas says, a small error in principle leads to a great error in conclusion. If you get off just a little tiny bit in your ethical principles, you're going to live to rue what you've done. And that, frankly, is one of the arguments in favor of religious revelation. Because man left to himself will very easily make mistakes in trying to reason out ethics. And that's the argument for God needing to have given us something like the Ten Commandments so that we wouldn't get off the track. Not that this has kept us on the track perfectly, of course. Okay. Let's look at Kant. Oh, this is this is one of those things that can open up hugely, and I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it tonight, but we'll start. My temptation when I see Kant is I want to teach you the whole of Kant. And that, of course, would be a course in itself, wouldn't it? So we can't do that. So I got to restrict it. Okay. Deontological ethics. This is the ethics of what we ought to do. This is part of, he divides his philosophy into the critique of speculative reason and the critique of practical reason. And this falls under practical reason. He's very critical of speculative reason. He would argue that the speculative reason, which is what most of us would call philosophy, metaphysics, goes beyond what the human mind is capable of doing. What we really know is only our own direct and immediate experience, our subjective experience. So, where he finds the basis for morality is in what he calls universal and necessary moral imperatives. An imperative is a command. And what he's looking for is not a conditional imperative, but what he calls a categorical imperative. The imperative that says, you shall not steal, you shall not lie, you shall not commit murder. And he says this is one of those things that's just built into us, that the two things he's sure of in all of existence, and one of them is the existence of law within himself. We are aware that we have within us operating a moral law. And because it is subjective, he kind of gets away from the epistemological problems he has with things that are what he calls transcendent to the phenomenon. So for him, the only truly good thing is what he calls a good will. The only unqualified good is a good will. And in a sense, he's got a good point there. Because after all, in all of nature, in all of the world that we find, nothing can help itself. Inorganic world does whatever nature says. Vegetables have no choice. Animals follow their instincts and emotions. And for the most part, we are driven by these same physiological mechanisms that condition our behavior and emotions. And we are limited in what we know. Kant was, of course, big on because of his idealistic epistemology, very restrictive about what the mind could know. But he said, but the one thing that and I wasn't trying to speak from the Kantian perspective just now, but the one thing that is unquestionably good in a human being is having a good will. Now, you might get into arguments as to, well, what should the good will be about and how do we know what's the right thing to do and so forth. But we all give credit to people if somebody was at least trying to do the right thing. If in their heart of hearts they were operating from a good motive and they truly meant to do the right thing. The reason we're so suspicious of that is because we see so many people manipulating this so as to justify what is really a bad will. But if someone's will is truly good, surely this is pleasing in the sight of God, no matter what mistakes they make. That's true, not just for Kant. But Kant then goes on to try to figure out, how do we know when we've got a good will? And there where he gets into a bit of trouble, because he says that a good will acts out of a sense of duty. So in a very real sense, if you're enjoying doing the right thing, you got a problem there. A little bit of Calvinism there. You just got to do it because it's the law. You got to do it because you have respect for law and you're going to follow your duty. But then the question is, how do I know what the law is? The law has to be, he says, universal. It's got to apply to everybody. It's got to be necessary, That is to say, it's got to be a means which will realize a legitimate kingdom of ends. And it's got to be structured as an imperative. In other words, it's got to say, you must do something. So how are you going to get a law, a rule, that applies to everybody, and it's got to be this way? And this is where he comes up with the notion of the categorical imperative. There's two kinds of imperatives. The hypothetical imperative is if A, then B, but that's not what he's concerned about. He's concerned about what's called the categorical imperative. That is an unconditional imperative. It means under all circumstances you must not tell a lie. And indeed, how are you supposed to know that? What's supposed to tell you this? There are two ways that you can formulate what he calls the categorical imperative. One says to act in such a way that your personal maxim will be a universal law. In other words, act in such a way that what you are going to do, you could will for everybody else to do. So the question being, can I tell a lie? Well, okay, I might want to tell a lie in this circumstance because it seems very useful. But if I can tell a lie here, I've got to be willing to say you can tell a lie there. And everybody else can lie anytime they want. But I can't possibly want people to be able to lie willy-nilly anytime they want. So it must be that I am not permitted ever to tell a lie. This is the argument he uses against lying. You could never will that everybody do this. In other words, if it's okay for me to lie now, I should be able to will that you lie anytime you want. Well, I can't do that. So it must be that lying is immoral. He also has another principle, another way of putting the categorical imperative, and that is he says, never treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of others, as merely a means, but rather always as an end in themselves. So you always have to respect the human person, which is a laudable goal. I mean, one can understand that. So that if everybody does this, everybody operates in such a way that everything that they would will that everybody else would do, then the kingdom of ends will be realized and people will live ethically. The respect for persons will take place. So, as it says in your notes, here's another way of putting it. So act, your act, as a maxim, could be a universal law. Could you ever break a promise? Well, if you break a promise, then you could say everybody else could break promises. You can't do that. Obviously, you can never lie. You can't will that people should lie because you can't will that for that reason, you can't will that you can lie. I can't will to do murder because then I'd have to allow everybody else to do murder. So this is his way of establishing an ethical principle or a code of ethics. The difficulty is, he says to conform to duty, but one problem is there are some acts that we don't do just from duty, but they are virtuous. For example, celibacy. Is there anything wrong with somebody being celibate? As a matter of fact, we view this in many instances as a very high degree of virtue. Could we will, therefore, that everybody should be celibate? Well, that wouldn't work too well, would it? In other words, there are some acts that in themselves are morally good, but you still can't will that everybody follow that principle. That wouldn't work. Or again, sometimes we go beyond what duty requires. That's a whole notion of heroism or sanctity, heroic sanctity. We don't ask that everybody be a saint. We don't ask that everybody be a hero. We don't ask that everybody win the Congressional Medal of Honor. But are we therefore to conclude that what they do is morally wrong? All right, so anyway, that's the Kantian perspective. I'm not going to go further into it right now, and I'm not even sure I'm going to go further into it later on. We will proceed with F in our next class, where we get back to the objective basis of morality in terms of natural law. We've done the history for the most part.
Sound production copyright Olteen Library Services 2013, www.aquinasphilosophy.com.